Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this, the first of 6 webinars brought to you by the ASEAN Climate Governance Network and Sustainable Futures Institute Asia. My name is Johan Raslan, and I'm from ACGN, which is a network of like-minded institutes of directors under the auspices of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative, part of the alphabet soup that we have to know nowadays. We really hope that in these 6 webinars, we are going to be able to share some wide experiences that we have here in the ASEAN region and make some great changes happen in companies and business. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we meet the day after the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued its final warning to governments, businesses, and the human race. IPCC says that the world is failing to make the changes we need if we are going to limit future heating to just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If we don't change, IPCC says temperatures are going to soar to more than 3 degrees Celsius higher than they were before industrial levels. The result will be catastrophe. Well, against that frightening backdrop, let's meet our panelists who will answer some questions today. First, Helge Muenkel is the brand new Chief Sustainability Officer at DBS Bank, one of the big 3 Singapore banks. Before DBS, Helge worked at the Dutch bank ING, where he played a key role in developing sustainable advisory services and sustainable transactions. He has worked in Frankfurt, Munich, London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, and others. Tayakorn, secondly, is the Director of Bond Department within the Securities and Exchange Commission of Thailand. The Thai SEC celebrates its 30th anniversary next month, and its mission is to assure conducive environment to a fair, dynamic, and inclusive capital market. Tayakorn is a lawyer by training, and he has studied in Thailand, the UK, and France. His work in the SEC has included sustainable bonds, taxonomy standards, and disclosure standards for sustainability. Last but not least, Jenifer Thien is an independent director at UEM Edgenta Berhad. UEM Edgenta is a Malaysian multinational company listed on Bursa Malaysia, and it operates in Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, and India. With a background in food and supply chains, Jenifer spent 15 years working outside Malaysia, in Singapore, Bangkok, Beijing, and the US. She now heads up her own consulting practice, and she lectures and advises, amongst other things, on supply chain, sustainability, and ESG. I hope you agree with me, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a very knowledgeable, very international, and very diverse panel for you today. And I can tell you, they are raring to go. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this webinar will have 3 sections. First of all, I'm going to ask the panelists some introductory questions to set the scene, and they will each set out kind of where they are coming from in a maximum of 5 minutes each. Panelists, 5 minutes each maximum. Then I will ask some quick fire questions to each of the panelists to get some discussion going. And last, again, but not least, your question, please. Please write them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. So if you see me looking down, I'm looking at another screen which holds the Q&A box. I'm waiting for your questions. And I'll be trying to understand them and try to work out who is good to answer them. So please send them in. Really, they're all welcome. Now we aim to close the session at around 4:15 p.m. Singapore, Manila, Malaysia time, 3:15 p.m. for most of the rest of you. So how's that? With your permission, I will now start the scene-setting questions. Well, first of all, Helge, please provide some insights, if you can, about how capital markets are looking at ESG in the finance ecosystem and how sustainability affects capital allocation and credit deployment. And if you can, share a bit about DBS's strategy to achieve net zero carbon emissions. I know you have some slides. You're the only one with slides today. So, okay, let's see your slides if you can note them. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Do you see my slides?
Yep, absolutely.
And I promise I will keep it to below 5 minutes. So thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure. I think I have really 5 slides which I wanted to use because sometimes it helps to visualize a few things. But I think the video and Johan's introductory words were already key. We have daunting sustainability challenges ahead of ourselves. And what this means is that we need to really completely rewire our economies. We need to completely change the way we go about business and transition to lower carbon, more sustainable societies. And very importantly, we need to do this in a just manner because different people will be affected by this transition in different ways. And we need to make sure that we take everyone along on this journey. The simple message of this first slide: nobody can do this alone. We will need ecosystem changes. We need the governments to step up. We need the private sector to step up, and we need the financial institutions to step up, all of us embedded in the community at large, to really get rolling. And one of our key roles in financial institutions is the reallocation of capital away from unsustainable and towards sustainable activities. Now, while the sustainability challenges are daunting, what is promising to see is an acceleration of efforts. And what makes me very confident that we also get results is that we are now almost on a dual track. So what this slide shows is, on the one hand side, the pie charts, nation states stepping up, more and more countries committing to net zero, and also starting to actually come up with implementation plans. On the other side of the slide, you see the private sector. You see more and more companies having science-based decarbonization plans and targets. And this dual track is indeed very promising. Now, moving into the world of finance, I will differentiate between capital that you might get from institutional investors and those from banks. So this slide shows institutional investors. And the very simple message is, there's an explosion of assets under management that seeks to invest in some form of ESG-focused opportunities. This data shows assets under management by the United Nations Principles for Responsible Banking, but you can use any other data point. Ultimately, the direction of travel is very clear. There is a tsunami of money, no pun intended, to effectively invest in sustainable opportunities. Now, DBS is, of course, a major bank in the region, and we have a fairly comprehensive approach to sustainability. We have 3 pillars. Number 1, we call responsible banking, and that is very important for our clients because that is all about empowering our clients to transition. The cornerstone piece of this pillar is our commitment to being net zero in our financed emissions, so via our lending and investment portfolios, our scope 3 emissions, if you will, by 2050. And for an Asia-focused bank, that is, of course, very bold, but it's the right thing to do, and we are working vigorously on it. The second pillar is what we call responsible business practices. That's more around how we conduct ourselves as an organization. It cuts across many things. On the environmental side, we want to be carbon neutral in our own operations, so our scope 1 and 2, if you will, by the end of this year. And then we have pillar 3, impact beyond banking, which is really supporting social entrepreneurship, so businesses with a triple bottom line, as well as community causes. And our board has just approved another 100 million Singapore dollars to support this. Finishing off, I'm still within 5 minutes, Johan. The cornerstone piece that I mentioned, this reallocation of capital that will allow us to have our financed portfolios, our lending and financing portfolios aligned with net zero by 2050 is a fairly monumental change. And later in the year, we're going to publish white papers that will establish the methodology we are using to create science-based pathways and targets. What this slide in short means are 2 things. Number 1, we're going to be very transparent. We're going to tell everyone what we do and how. Number 2, this is a collaborative tool. We're not going to run away from clients, quite the opposite. We will go towards clients and discuss with them and ideate together, how can you transition and how can we as a financial institution support this transition. Thanks, Johan.
Thank you very much, Helge. Moving to you, Tayakorn. So you're from the Thailand regulators. What is the general direction that Thailand regulators are taking in respect of climate change? And what's specifically doing now? what's the mover behind it? What is pulling this? Tayakorn, I have to unmute first.
Okay, first of all, I have to thank you, Johan, to have me here. In Thailand, in financial area, we have 3 regulators, and we have the 3 regulator steering committee in Thailand, which include Bank of Thailand, Securities and Exchange Commission, and Office of Insurance Commission. We established and mandate the financial sector working group on sustainable finance to develop a sustainable finance policy framework to foster a culture of sustainable finance throughout Thailand financial sector. The member of working group consists of representatives from Fiscal Policy Office, which representing the Ministry of Finance, Bank of Thailand, SEC, and Office of Insurance Commission, and lastly, the Stock Exchange of Thailand. On August 2021, the working group has jointly published Sustainable Finance Initiative for Thailand. The 5 key sustainable finance initiatives, including the developing of the local taxonomy to prevent the greenwashing, creating the data environment, facilitating demand-led product and services, exploring the initiative for the market, and building the human capital. With the cooperation across all financial authorities, this will even more powerful to drive the sustainable finance in Thailand. For the capital market, the SEC together with stakeholders in capital market have laid out a roadmap on developing the ecosystem for sustainable finance. There are 3 areas that concern initiative to spur the action on climate governance among listed companies. The first area is the supply side. It is about the issuer and disclosure. To enhance ESG information, beginning this year, all listed companies in Thailand will need to disclose the sustainability information integrated with the business report. It's called the One Report, which will include the carbon emission information and the human rights issue according to the UNGP. We think the key mechanism rely on the tone from the top to each company. The board of directors should have a clear sustainability policy and assign a role and responsibility to the top management. It is also important to have a monitoring system via the clear-cut governance statute. The SEC have issued the corporate governance code for listed companies since 2018, which has placed high importance on the duty of the board of company. This has played a foundation role in driving the company toward the thought for long-term and sustainable growth while considering the impact for the stakeholder of the company. The second area is the demand side, the product. For the product, bond is one of the most prominent instruments in area of the sustainable development. We have seen promising trends of ESG bond. In 2021, the total value of such bond have been growing exponentially and has reached 9.47 billion US dollar in the term of green infrastructure. Most of proceeds were used by the renewable energy and clean transportation. The last area will be the cooperation. As I previously mentioned, as that we have the working group on sustainable finance, the SEC has been working closely with other finance authority and regulator to develop work plan to transform the 5 key sustainable finance initiatives into concrete action and tangible result. Yes.
Thank you, Tayakorn. So, Jenifer, we've heard the banker and the regulator, and it sounds like the mature capital markets regulator, what they're doing and what they're all doing in respect of sustainability and climate change. There seem to be piling pressures on our companies and us as board members, who we are, as you know, we're responsible for everything under the sun. This sounds like we're in for a strenuous time. So as our companies start their climate change or ESG journey, what new muscles do we need to develop to survive?
Yes, thank you for the question, Dr. Johan. So maybe in answering that question, I'd like to bring in some perspective based on my 26 years of experience at a company by the name of Mars Incorporated, and obviously more recently at UEM Edgenta. Maybe to kick off, I'll just a very brief context on who Mars Incorporated is. Right, it's a $36 billion US business involved in pet care, confectionery, food. It has about 110,000 employees around the world in more than 80 countries, and they have a very big manufacturing footprint, more than 130 manufacturing sites around the world. So Mars, as a business, was first faced with a series of sustainability and climate changes more than 15 years ago. And just to give you a flavor, right, we had deforestation and loss of biodiversity in cocoa in West Africa. We had issues of deforestation of palm in this part of the world, in Malaysia and Indonesia. We had greenhouse gas emission in dairy. And on top of that, we had to deal with child slavery and forced labor issues in cocoa, West Africa, overfishing in Thailand, and then the list goes on. And all of this seems to present itself to Mars in a very short period of time. Obviously, at that time, it was really unprecedented and totally uncharted territories for us. And as a big business with really strong brand names, obviously, we were put on the spotlight very quickly and held to account. So initially, very defensive, we soon realized that our old ways of working, our old ways of thinking will have to change, and we need to quickly adapt and develop new muscles, right? So if I take a minute to fast forward to today, the Mars Sustainable in a Generation plan, if you look it up, is held up as one of the role models in the fast-moving consumer goods world, and it does give the business a very strong foundation to deliver their commitments, which includes the net zero targets as well. But progress to get here has not been a straight line. It's more like a zigzag, right? And it starts with the acknowledgement that as a business with a huge environmental and social footprint, we have a huge responsibility to be part of the solution. So on the question of what muscles do we need to develop as we embrace the climate or ESG challenge, let me give you an overarching thought, right? That is really about mindset and approach. Like Tayakorn mentioned, this top-down tone from the top is really important. You know, needs to be led from the board and executive leadership all the way down to the organization. So very much earlier on in the journey, Mars tackled the question head on in terms of what does sustainable development really mean to the business? In other words, how can we continue to grow the business plus deliver great value to shareholders and then do it in a very sustainable way, right? It's critical that we decide how we want to respond, particularly because our operations and supply chain, it stretches to all parts of the globe, especially to the developing countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, where growth and expansion, you know, obviously is still critical to lift the economy status of these countries. And I'm sure all of us are very familiar with the definition of sustainable development, right? So it's about being able to meet the demands, the demands of the present generation without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? So we've all heard that before. We've seen that definition before, but what does that really mean? How do we make a business case of that? And And where Mars landed on this question is the realization that as a company, we need to start to think, behave, and act in order to, one, take full accountability and deal with our historical liability and old ways of doing business, which has impacted the environment, communities, human rights, and so on. So that is absolutely crucial, taking that ownership, acknowledging that, and understanding that what our impact has been, right? And it also starts in terms of thinking, behaving, and acting in order to meet the increased expectation of today's much wider multitude of stakeholders, right? So we're not talking only about consumer, customer, government, but we're really talking, we need to make sure that within the tent with us, together in the tent with us, we have our competitors, we have our critics, activists, regulators, everyone with us and partnering together to solve some really, really challenging issues. And that's a new muscle, right? How do we work together and how do we partner together? And the third thing is we need to start to think, behave, and act in order to take into account the interests and the rights of future generations, which for me is probably the biggest leap for any company, right? To operate with the future generations in mind. You know, so that's also I think a muscle that every company needs to develop. And so if that's how we should be behaving and thinking in terms of sustainable development, it does has consequences, right? And I'll take just a quick minute to talk about, you know, some huge implications for us. So one is that we can no longer regard the environment as a limitless pool of natural capital that we can just draw on without liability. And the second implication is that we need to accept that the environment and climate issues are so intertwined with human rights, with social issues. You can't really change one without impacting the other. And finally, I think there's a huge implication in terms of how we channel our capital appropriately. And Helge mentioned a little bit about that. So it's not only about how do we channel capital to deliver our decarbonization targets and to avoid stranded assets, but capital will also need to be diverted to make sure that social factors and social implications are addressed. So that, in a nutshell, is how Mars addressed the point of how do we bring sustainable development to life and how we do business. Climate obviously being a key component of that, and from there, those new muscles starts to develop. I'll stop here, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to explore more new muscles in our discussion. Johan, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So you kind of brought it together back down to the company, what we have to do. Back to the pricing bets there again, Helge. Well, so it seems that you have a lot of power here. You can advance the ESG agenda and push it forward by well, maybe even blacklisting the ones who aren't playing the game, or you can invest in and support the winners. So what is your DBS view and approach to all of this?
Yeah, that is a very intriguing question on winners and laggards. Let's not forget what we actually aim to do here. We want to create a healthy planet, and we want to do so in a just manner. Now, climate change is dictated by physical science. Social targets are determined by societal consensus. That is really driving what it is. And I'm saying this because how do you then define a laggard or winner? If I simplify for one moment our financings, it's almost like a traffic light, right? We're financing green stuff, think of generation of energy by renewable sources. And then there is on the other side of the spectrum, the brown stuff, think of energy generation by coal, which we know is not going to become green, so we don't want to do it. But then there is this gigantic piece in the middle, which we very often relate to as transition. Now, how do I define a winner or laggard? So if we talk to a client, that runs a fairly brown business today, and they haven't really done much yet, but they have a very credible plan and they have the willingness to implement it. Is this then a winner or is it a laggard? I think winner laggard is maybe not the way we think about it. The way we think about it really is collaboration, and our role as a financial institution is really to empower clients with the provision of capital. So I would answer your question by really referring to collaboration as a key tool.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. And sort of non-judgmental, approach to it. Tayakorn, sorry. Yes.
No, and if I may complement that, Johan, if I take a very tangible example, right? If we were to turn our back to a client that runs a fairly brown business today, we don't necessarily make the world a better place. Right? I mean, there are loads of data also out there that shows how private equity firms and so on pick up these assets. So we believe in sustainability. We want to empower our clients. So we actually believe engagement is much better than simply running away.
Right. Okay. Tayakorn, during COP26 last year, the conference, your Prime Minister expressed Thailand's willingness to fight climate change and aiming to reach carbon neutrality in 2050 and net zero emissions by 2065. What impact has this had on the corporate sector in Thailand? I would imagine it's quite a powerful and maybe surprising announcement.
Yes, after the Prime Minister announcement, there is a lot of movement is going on in Thailand. I think once the direction is clear, there would be stronger policy to achieve the target as well as the enabling environment that incentivize further and quicker action by the business. Currently, there have been more movement among business in Thailand. Many listed companies support more effective climate-related disclosure by adopting global disclosure standards and guidelines such as TCFD, GRI, CDP, and SDG. And many listed companies, especially the large ones, have announced their net zero policy. Some of them actually proceed to fulfill the pledge by adjusting business policy, using new technology, changing the business model to be environmental friendly, like using more clean energy, and disclosing what they have done to enhance their transparency relate to emission information to investor and other stakeholders. In fact, I can see a lot of companies are announcing their ESG strategy and organizing the ESG symposium almost every week. And I think this is such a great momentum in pushing the ESG agenda forward in Thailand.
Thank you. So the tone from the top that's set by government is really important. I think I've seen that in other countries, including Malaysia as well. Some governments use the COP26 to make announcements, and that has spurred action. Jenifer, you talked a bit about, expand a bit about the stakeholder engagement, because you mentioned a wide range of stakeholders, and you mentioned something which is really, Asian companies are just getting to grips with thinking about even their employees as stakeholders. Previously them and us, now employees as stakeholders. But you mentioned competitors can be a stakeholder and working together with them. Tell us a bit about what that means.
Yeah. I think how we think about stakeholder management and stakeholder relationship management today, Dato Johan, is clearly very different from, let's say, 5-10 years ago, right? So if we do a stakeholder mapping today, it would clearly be very different if we had done the same exercise a decade ago. We definitely have more stakeholders. And everyone, maybe due to and driven by the social media as well, everyone has an equal share of voice as well. So I think one of the things that we need to learn is as organizations in as businesses and public listed companies and so on is to build the muscle in terms of how do we partner and listen to our critiques, right, and try to understand the angle of where they're coming from. Listening to activists, for example. So that's something that we need to, and my observation is that in this part of the world, it's a muscle that we need to build very quickly, right? How do we not be defensive? How do we listen with good intent? And more importantly, to build that trust, because at some point, when there's good trust around the table, you can find that some of these critics and some of these activists, they do have some good ideas to share, right? So the other thing that I would put on the table is that we need to really develop the ability or capability to work together as a sector to drive change. I must say that this is particularly in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, I think there's an opportunity for us, for some of the sectors to come together and collaborate and partner more productively. In order for us to do this well, we need to be clear of what's pre-competitive and what's competitive, right? Because pre-competitive will be issues where, number one, you can only change if you come together with scale. All of you band together as a sector. Pre-competitive issues would be issues where if one party in the sector is faced with that issue, the whole sector suffers, right? So it's very important to define what those pre-competitive challenges are and work on them together. And more often than not, these are obviously very, very complex issues that you can't solve alone, right? So, and you need to come together, work with the lawmakers, work with governments and activists to lobby your case. So the question I would have for us is, are we doing enough collectively as a sector? What role can you play? Is it as a leader, as a supporter, or as a follower? Do you know what's competitive or pre-competitive for your business? Thank you.
Great point. And you mentioned there activists is something which companies generally, I think, find very frightening. The thought of sitting around the table with activists. So we've done a little bit in Climate Governance Malaysia and CEO Action Network Malaysia, and it worked out very well, actually. They are just human beings, and we're all actually on the same page. So, yes, so that's an excellent point. How what we need to do, but you as a member of the executive team in DBS Bank, I'm sure there are sometimes differences of opinion within the leadership team, how to balance short-termers versus long-term investments and sustainability, as Jenifer was talking about. How do you reconcile these? We all face this as we sit in our either executive leadership team or we sit in our board meeting. We're not all on the same page all the time. How do we move things forward in these teams? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, not being on the same page is probably business as usual, right? For so many other matters as well, but I appreciate on sustainability as well. But if I put this into context, I would actually say that over the last few years, in my humble experiences at the two banks that I worked over the last few years, as well as with all the clients that are Interact, senior management is actually more and more embracing the long-term business case for sustainability. So I don't think that it is completely unique in what you just said, as there are different opinions out there. I think there is more and more among senior leaders actually an understanding that having a purpose-led organization is very, very important. And why this is, I think Jenifer mentioned stakeholders quite a lot. We are all subject to many stakeholders, right? Our clients, our customers, our employees, shareholders, governments. And I'm pretty sure that all senior leaders ask themselves, what are our stakeholders thinking? And there is so much data out there, which very clearly indicates that all our stakeholders around us take sustainability more and more seriously. So what I see is actually more and more embracing of this topic from a strategic point of view. What I see is more and more purpose-led organizations. And one key item, I think, which is very important also for us as a bank, what we experience very often, if companies embrace sustainability, they're very often more innovative. They're actually becoming better businesses. So rather than seeing sustainability as something like a compliance thing, I need to do it so I don't do anything right, changing this mindset to this is actually a golden opportunity. That is what I really see. So this link between sustainability and innovation. So I may not have addressed the question exactly as you wanted, but what I actually really think is happening is more and more embracing strategically the topic.
Right. Thank you. So, Tayakorn, you're involved in disclosures, and I'm sure in the past you've come across a lot of greenwashing, and nowadays people sometimes call it climate washing, kind of the same thing. What are some examples of greenwashing, and why is it that regulators don't like it? What harm does it do, and what are you trying to do about it in your capital markets in Thailand?
Okay, greenwashing in the rush it to be seen as a environmentally friendly company, often exaggerated claim or simple make things up. I will give the example of the case. I think you might seen the picture of the sea turtle with the plastic straw in its nose. Many wildlife conservation organizations use this picture to call out to stop using the plastic straw. So my example today is about stop using plastic straw campaign in a company. In 2019, a food company, so I didn't mention any name, introduced paper straw in their restaurant, which is good for environmental and sea creature, but it may not good for customer because it's very hard to use when it's soggy. But it's not the point today. The point today is if you looking down and when many people turn out that those paper straw couldn't recycle, and it involved the questionable practice of cutting down the trees to make this disposable straw. So this is the kind of example of the greenwashing. So it's maybe some project that is very make too easy and claim that it's green, but it's not the real green and it cannot make the impact. For the question, what harm does it do? It can be said that continuation of widespread greenwashing could erode customer confidence in claim of environmental responsibility, dampening the market for such products. Therefore, we try to develop the taxonomy to prevent the case like this. The local taxonomy will serve as common definition and classification system of economic activity deemed as environmentally sustainable. It aligns the regulator activity deemed as sustainable finance policy is cohesive manner and encourage innovative financial product and service, attaching funding toward achievement of Thailand's sustainability goal. Besides classification, sustainable activity based on contribution to environmental objects and technical criteria. The taxonomy will also mitigate the potential for the greenwashing.
Okay, thank you very much. So taking this greenwashing over to Jenifer, there seems to be a lot of discussion on greenwashing, climate washing today. It seems a big topic. In fact, this Climate Social Science Network in January issued a report all on the subject and talked about legal cases and laws to fight to fight greenwashing? Why do you feel it's harmful? After all, come on, it's just a bit of marketing, isn't it? All good stuff, as Tayakorn said, it's just a bit of exaggeration. Is it a bad thing? And how can businesses avoid being perceived in this light? It's just easy to fall into the trap, right, of greenwashing rather than doing something substantive.
I know. I think greenwashing, as Tayakorn said, in the end, it just doesn't benefit everybody. It's just jeopardize the credibility of the entire movement, right? If I can just boil it down to that, But to your question about how do we avoid being perceived in this light? How do we avoid being perceived as greenwashing? I think the posture is very important. Being authentic, being honest, and start from good intentionality, right? So I think that posture is very important, and therefore, talking about muscles again, Dato Johan, when you embark on this journey, the one thing that you really need to be very good at is communication, because you're gonna need a lot of communication within your organization and externally. You're gonna be communicating more than you've ever done before, right? And how do you communicate? The tone and posture is very important, so that trust is created, and I think trust is broken when you announce, for example, when you announce a target, right? So you have a lot of people announcing, I'm going to be net zero by 2050, but then there's not a lot to back that up. What's the interim plan? How do you plan to get there? Yes, you may not have a detailed month by month or year by year, but what's your 2-year target? How many % are you going to drive down in 2 years? What's the impact that you want to drive in the short term? I think it's important for companies to back up their targets with some short-term plan. It's obviously important to show results. And here's the other thing, that don't be afraid to talk about your challenges and where you are failing, right? I think greenwashing, people tend to have that doubt because you are only telling the good story. You're only telling all the positives in all the sustainability reports. Everybody is great. The world is all sunshine and goodness, and we all know that is not the case, right? So I really believe that vulnerability is a strength. So if you are, and I've had this, and I've had this example, had this experience when you talk about all the interaction with activists and critiques, right? The moment you sit down and be vulnerable and say, I don't know how to do it, I have this problem, then the tone of the discussion change, because once you admit that, then you are basically admitting that, look, I need help. I am willing to show you my challenges, and we want to work together. So I would love to see actually more companies being open about where are they having problems, right? Why are they not being able to deliver, some of their targets? And then one last point is that I do see there is a mishmash, and maybe this is just the stage where we are at the moment. There's a lot of CSR kind of activities being brought into the whole ESG or climate topic, right? So if you donate money to a school, which is all good, right? If you have a charity that you support, all of that is good. Don't stop doing it. But when you introduce that and then make it part of your ESG program, then I think that's where it gets a bit wobbly. Right? It is a very slippery slope. So I think just be careful of that. So thank you.
Yeah, ESG versus CSR, and Tayakorn's example was really a CSR thing, which was being brought in as ESG or sustainability, which clearly it was not. So it was a good example there. Thank you again, Jenifer, and thank you, Tayakorn, for that point there. I'll just change it a little bit. We talk about the difficulties, and I think, Helge, you talked about some of the things you have to persuade and work with companies to do things they don't want to do and make changes that appear wrong to them. But never mind, let's move aside from the costs, if you like. What about opportunities? Opportunities for emerging markets. What opportunities are there, and in ASEAN region in particular, around sustainability and climate change for companies?
Yeah, that's a very broad question, Johan. Is it related to carbon credits or really overall across the board?
Well, if you want to talk about carbon credits, yes, but overall across the board, anything that you...
Yeah, I think let me maybe start by repeating one thing that I really so firmly believe in generally. And that's based on the experience of working with hundreds of clients on this for many years now. The point really is, if companies embrace sustainability, and apologies for repeating this, they generally have a tendency to becoming more innovative because they're more aware of, for example, the risks that might actually threaten them, whether it's physical risks or we call this sometimes transition risks. Think about a petrochemicals company that ultimately produces a plastic bottle and think there is a smart kid somewhere in KL or wherever, and they're producing a new product that's based on bioplastics. The company might simply run out of business. So my clear conviction is that generally companies actually become more innovative as they embrace this. Now, if you ask me about Southeast Asia from a macro point of view, I mean, what are the big industries first and foremost that, of course, need to be rewired? Well, first and foremost, obviously, the energy sector. Right. So, of course, here in the region, we are still very much dependent on coal. But I've mentioned already before that we want to make sure we not only transition, but we have a just transition. So how do we take care of the people that are also negatively affected by the transition? But of course, the energy transition as a whole in Asia Pacific is going to be a fairly huge one. I mean, the Singapore government has come out with new plans, by the way, on how they're going to embrace renewable energy as an example. Now, another point, and that leads me to this other topic that I just mentioned, is carbon credits. What is that actually? So we are in the precarious situation on climate for one simple reason. We have put too much carbon into the atmosphere. So in layman's terms, we now have to go into reverse and decarbonize. And one powerful tool of accomplishing this is put a price on carbon. There are different ways of doing it. There are carbon taxes, like for example in Singapore. There are compliance markets, like in Europe, they call it a cap and trade market. And there are voluntary markets, all of which ultimately have one goal, which is put a price on carbon. And here is actually a very interesting opportunity, especially for Southeast Asia, which has a lot of nature. Think about Indonesia's vast amount of forest as an example. So what are these carbon markets and how can corporates actually use them? Why would corporates use them? Well, that depends a little bit on the answer to the question, are you subject to compliance rules on carbon? Yes or no? So for example, in Singapore, we have a carbon tax that certain corporates need to pay. And in the future, 5% of this tax can actually be addressed by international carbon credits. Then when would corporates use carbon credits? Well, there's typically a hierarchy of actions. First, you want corporates to prevent carbon emissions. Then you would want them to avoid or reduce carbon emissions. And then as part of a depending a bit on the sector, part of their strategy, there might be some unavoidable hard to abate emissions, which could then be addressed by carbon credits. And why do I mention all of this? This is for Southeast Asia specifically a very interesting field, simply because there's of course loads of nature-based solutions that they can actually be offered. And in Singapore, we have what we call the Climate Impact X, CIX, which is a carbon exchange and marketplace, very new, which effectively facilitates that and creates trust and an efficient pricing mechanism for corporates to actually use carbon credits as part of their decarbonization strategy. So loads of different opportunities depending on the sector, Johan, so a bit difficult to capture it all in one answer.
Well, thank you. Some questions are coming in now from the Q&A box. So I'm going to turn to some of these. And Tayakorn, something somebody's raising is that we seem to see similar policies coming from the different regulators. Do the regulators talk to each other in ASEAN? Is that why you kind of quite similar approaches?
Okay, actually we have a cooperation at the ASEAN level, focusing particularly on the climate agenda, as the ASEAN economy and well-being rely heavily on the climate-sensitive sector, such as agricultural, forestry, and tourism. So we think it is important to build an ASEAN asset class for sustainable investment, which will attach huge investment to leverage the green recovery and build infrastructure in response to the climate change and the social issue. However, the creation of the sustainable asset class in ASEAN and more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient financial system require the alignment and consistent action of all capital market participants and stakeholders, including regulators, issuers, investors, and financial institutions. Through engagement with key stakeholders and a comprehensive review of international and regional landscape, ASEAN Capital Market Regulator, ACMF, has developed a roadmap for ASEAN Sustainable Capital Market, which provide the strategic direction and recommend that take into account domestic priority and market structure. The ACMF is currently progressing on the path toward the transition to a greener and a more inclusive economy. Also, the initiative under respective ACMF working group to allow ASEAN to promote its green and sustainable asset class include developing, for example, the Sustainability Disclosure Standard, the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, the ASEAN SLB Standard, the ASEAN Sustainable and Responsibility Fund Standard, and lastly, the ASEAN Transition Standard.
Right. Thank you. I want to move to the boardroom now. There's a question that asks Jenifer, from your experiences, what are the typical challenges or roadblocks faced by companies as they embark on the climate journey, and what is the board directors going to? Should the board tackle it? Because we have many stakeholders. One of the key stakeholders today is board members.
Yeah, I tell you, there's one thing I can promise you is there's not going to be any shortage of challenges, right? So, but I'll mention a few, and I'm sure Helge and Tayakorn can also jump in. So right on top of my list would be, a lot of companies face the challenge of how do they build the business case, right? And for me, I think it's really about how do you go beyond the traditional financial lenses, right? And you need to really define how do you measure success, so your performance, your KPIs would definitely need to change. And I think this is something that the board, I think, needs to have a strong hand in as well. And I think having the ability and knowing how to incorporate the cost of carbon into your business case, I think is something that every business needs to learn to do. So I know of a lot of companies have already started to incorporate the cost of offsetting, all right, into the alternative, into their business case. $20 in order to justify their investment. Yeah. So and for that matter, you can put in any amount, right? But it's important to just make sure that you incorporate the cost of carbon within that business case. I think the other challenge, Johan, is obviously balancing the short and long term, because every business you need to deliver the short term performance, and yet you're trying to look 3, 4, 5 years out. Some of your investment, and Helge talk about innovation, which I totally agree, and some of that needs a lot of investment upfront and will take we'll have a gestation period, right? Maybe 3, 4, 5 years along the road. But in the meantime, you need to keep delivering your business performance. So balancing that short term and long term, is very critical. Again, the board needs to step in here and help to manage that balancing act, right? So I also think that we should not be boiling the ocean as well. So when you start to look at your materiality map, and when you start to look at your data, you would be inundated and you would say, wow, there's so much that we can do. There's so much that we should be doing. But this is where having a clear strategy on what are the few things that we can focus in and drive that will deliver the highest impact. There is always an 80-20 there. What are the 5 things that we must do that will help us to move the needle rather than stretch our resources, across 20, 30 things, right? So building that strategy, I think it's a challenge as well as an opportunity as well. I think the other challenge that a lot of companies are facing today, Johan, is capacity and capability building, right? Do they have the right people leading the initiatives? Do they have the right amount of people within the organization? So this is where, whether at the board level, at the senior executive level, this is not something that you do on a Friday afternoon, right? You got to put aside resources. You got to invest in resources. You got to build it into somebody's job description. It is not something that they do. They cannot get you that data when they are free, right? So I think rewiring, I think someone talked about rewiring just now, rewiring the organization so that they can work in that in this direction in order to deliver this vision. Rewiring the organization is very, very critical. Resourcing it, making sure that we build the expertise, and making sure that there's enough people that can do the work. Some of this expertise, I can tell you have to build it from within. You can't really. I think that there's some resources that you're not just gonna go out and recruit it externally, right? It's because we are in a brand new space. We'll really need to create some of this from scratch.
Okay, I just want to, Jenifer, I just want to roll back a little bit to something you mentioned. You mentioned KPIs. And this is something which there's a lot more focus on internationally now, which is CEO remuneration, CEO KPIs, building sustainability and climate issues into the CEO KPI list. So easy to say, very easy for regulators like Tayakorn to say, oh, you must do. But people like you, Jenifer, got to do it in the nomination committee on the board. How do you do that? Is it easy? Is it expensive?
If you talk about, if you're referring to how do we drive the agenda using compensation and remuneration as a tool, definitely it works. We've all seen it. We all have stories to share about how this can be a very effective tool, right? But so this is where I think we also need to be careful to make sure that the targets, the KPIs, right, in which we remunerate, whether it's our senior leadership or across the organization, they've got to be the right KPIs. I have seen quite flaky KPIs, if I got to be honest, right? And then this is where we fall into the greenwashing trap again. That we have a KPI that is, I'm just stabbing in the dark here a bit. So if we have a KPI that we will deliver the strategy, the ESG strategy by Q3 2022, and that becomes a KPI, and that's, it's quite flaky, right? So I think if we really want to drive action, we got to make sure that it's the right target. Some of it could be short-term, and short-term targets is probably very useful for for across the organization from the bottom up, and for the senior leadership, hold them to account on the targets that will require long-term strategy thinking, right? So there's all kinds of levers that we can obviously pull here, but it is a very, very effective tool, Johan.
And Johan,
Okay.
if I may
Yes.
compliment that, I mean, Jenifer speaks my heart, but I think we also should consider this a little bit as a journey. So 20 years ago, everyone talked about digitalization. I don't think that on day one, everyone was perfectly equipped to translate digitalization strategies into an ROE or whatever financial return you wanted to come up with. So all the things that Jenifer mentioned are so important, right? I mean, you need to have a purpose-led organization. There needs to be a governance structure, the right culture, you set KPIs and so on. But I think the honest struggle is at the moment that you don't have perfect data and information for all of this. So it's a little bit of a journey and a bit of a leap of faith, as was the case 20 years with digitalization. I think ultimately we're all working on better data, better information that would allow us to set better KPIs and all these types of things. But I think you also don't necessarily want to wait until you have the perfect system in place. You embrace this holistically and get moving.
Yeah. I'll fully agree with that, Helge,
Right.
because talking about the board, the role of the board here is to help the business to deal with that ambiguity, right? Because data is not perfect, and it probably will not be perfect for a while to come. Methodologies are still being landed, or so I think dealing with ambiguity is probably one of the many skills that a board need to have, as they steer the company. Couldn't agree more.
Helge, seems you said that, and I got a question, quick one for you, by the way, Helge, from Daniel. Do you charge higher interest rate to punish greenwashing companies? Just a quick one, yes or no, I suppose.
Yeah, there are actually quite a few questions from.
I have another question.
Sorry, I think there is a lag. I don't know whether it's on my side, but there were two related questions from Daniel. First, he asked, do you also offer lower interest rates for more sustainable businesses? Look, the short answer to both of these related questions is yes, we do offer lower interest rates for more sustainable businesses. It's always going to be case by case, very obviously, but bear in mind that at the moment as a bank, we don't yet have risk systems in place that would allow us, for example, to hold less capital for sustainable loan as compared to a conventional loan. So we subsidize this, yes, in certain cases, because we strongly believe more sustainable businesses are going to be better businesses. Yeah, it's a little bit of that element. Do we punish greenwashers? That's a bit of a, difficult to answer the question. I would need a little bit of the context, because what normally happens, of course, is we engage with our clients, right? And we would call out and then we discuss it together. But ultimately, as I think I made clear in my inaugural messages, we're gonna reallocate step by step over time, capital away from unsustainable and towards more sustainable businesses. And greenwashers, depending on what the definition of Daniel is, would of course be a bit more unsustainable businesses. So you allocate away.
Okay. Okay, and now I've got another question, last question from for his company via WhatsApp. So you can't see it, so it's a bit unfair. I'm very sorry. So back to the IPCC report just released yesterday, categorically states that we need to peak by 2025. And while many businesses are working towards net zero, so for all of you, please, all three of you, Helge, and Tayakorn and Jenifer, while many businesses are working towards it, what are you seeing? Is there a sense of urgency or not? As a regulator, as an allocator of capital, Helge, as a former, former global head of procurement in a multinational, Jenifer, are you seeing a sense of urgency, or is it kind of like a slowly?
So if I can go first, in
Yes.
my humble view, if I reflect on the last 5 to 10 years, then absolutely yes. I see an acceleration of efforts. What we need to make sure, though, action matters. right? Not words. So we need to make sure that, for example, the nation states that come up with net zero plans actually implement it. We need to make sure that the private sector who comes up with statements implements it. Nobody is interested in words as such, action matters. But I would absolutely clearly see, and I think I mentioned this on one of my slides, there's a huge acceleration in the private sector as well as among countries. If you just, sorry, as an anecdote, if you compare the media coverage of COP26 with the media coverage of COP16, even my mom called me and asked me, Helge, what is this COP26? I continuously see it on TV. So I think there is a growing consciousness in the community at large and across so many stakeholders that I would absolutely see yes. But the question is a good one, because I flip it around. We also don't have time left. Without being too technical now, we're running out of our carbon budget, and we have around 7 or 8 years left to effectively halve carbon emissions in our global economies. So this is a fairly daunting task. So we see an acceleration of efforts. We have to make sure we implement on it.
I fully agree with that. So if I think about, I mentioned earlier about the journey that we have been through at Mars Incorporated, going back more than 15 years ago. Clearly in the last few years, we have accelerated a huge amount, and we have seen whether it's the government. I think there was Helge's first slide. You had the government. I think the middle one is it the
finance and then private sector.
The finance, and then the finance sector, and then also the private sector. Are all stepping up. Tremendously. You can't open your newspaper today without something on this. And today, our Bursa Malaysia chairman has also just released a letter to all of the all of the public listed companies on this very topic as well. So what I would say is that it's great to see that the governments are all pushing and wanting to drive this forward. All of the players are all saying the right things. But what I would say is that all companies, you will go through a journey, right? So if you are starting your journey today, probably you're going to start from a mindset of compliance. I just want to comply, right? I just want to get these people off my back, right? And that's fine. That is totally fine. Everybody starts that way, right? So there is a lot of, there is a bit of a stick to sort of get things moving. But along the way, as I think it was Helge who mentioned, that along the way you will realize that, hey, this is a much better way of doing business. It makes good business sense, right? And it's much and it sustains your business over the long term. So whatever journey, whatever stage you are, whether you are just complying or whether you've already you're maybe already knowing that this could be a real good thing for your business, whatever you are in that part of in what spectrum of the journey, I think it's clearly that there's a lot of expectations. If I can use the analogy of the kettle is boiling, right? The whistle is already boiling, and it feels like we are in that space at the moment where we need to show our actions.
Thank you.
For me, okay, sorry, Johan,
yes, yes, go ahead.
Okay, for me, I totally agree with Jenifer and Helge. I think it's time to act now. It's no better time. It's better to start now. And the change, it cannot be happen if you just doing by yourself or just doing in just one organization. You have to drive it together to go to the goal. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to close all this and hand it over. Helge, thank you so much. What you said, including we're all part of an ecosystem. It takes all players to fight climate change. And also that the ecosystem itself needs to change through collaboration, working together. And also very, very importantly, that I think a lot of people fail to realize that sustainable businesses are better businesses ultimately, and more innovative ones. Tayakorn, we've heard very rousing things from you as a regulator, but we don't normally hear, in the past. This is probably the new face of the regulator. Greenwashing is a problem, and we need reliable disclosures of sustainability information from companies. And government tone from the top, as Jenifer has said, is so important. And like your government is actually showing that direction. And also importantly, what kind of perhaps we miss sometimes is that regulators in different countries in ASEAN are collaborating together and sharing the things that they are doing, which is why kind of very similar approaches that we see. And what you have said, a very rousing speech, is time to act is now to make the change. Thank you. And Jenifer, as the happy board of director who has all the responsibility, we know the why after COP26 that you said, and the latest IPCC report. We now have to work on the how. Boards and executive leadership have to have a sustainability mindset, you've said. A multitude of stakeholders that you've added, some more stakeholders to the list, are watching us and wanting to work together and wanting to work together with us in companies. And when it comes to communication, we have to communicate the real story to build the trust, not just the good news. Good news is so easy, right? Back to Tayakorn's CSR greenwashing thing. It's a journey, but the journey has become a more urgent one now. And I suppose from all of us here, climate change, well, it's real, folks. It's not fluff, as some people used to say. It's coming at us like a deadly tsunami, much faster than we expected. It's time to act, and time to act together. And let's build, as Jenifer said, the muscles and to build the trust. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks, by the way, to Climate Governance Malaysia for setting up the mechanics of this session today. I will now hand over to Sunita Rajakumar from ASEAN Climate Governance Network to close this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Johan. What a great session that was. We've heard from a capital markets regulator, Tayakorn, an allocator of capital, Helge, and a former global head of procurement, Jenifer. They have been brilliant. Thank you, Johan, for the deft moderating, and to the panelists for their generosity in sharing their valuable insights and knowledge. While we were all very sober about the enormous risks that we are facing and the direction of travel needed, we understand that based on our current commitments, all countries are on track for 2.7 degrees of warming. But despite that, the tone remained positive. And I liked the call to be more innovative, rewiring the organization, the reminder that perfect can be the enemy of good, that we need to get started now, the boards need to be comfortable with ambiguity. And as we've heard repeatedly, we need all stakeholders to come along on this journey. In the closing remarks, I especially liked change cannot happen with one organization. We recognize we are collectively facing extreme weather events, chronic underinvestment in adaptation measures, entire industries are transitioning, there is a loss of critical biodiversity, we are going to be seeing an influx of economic refugees who are climate refugees, there is a risk that your human capital could be your largest stranded asset. So please, every single one of you, commit to keeping this crucial conversation of respectful dialogue going. Help us to grow this network by publicizing these events widely to your colleagues. Today's event was on how the climate agenda is going to affect me with a focus on listed companies. In a month's time, we're going to hear about how the climate agenda is going to affect the business with an SME focus. This is the first network of all institutes of directors in the region. We've had many conversations with this small band of pioneering directors who feel strongly about the crisis we're facing and who understand the risks and the urgent need to increase our climate resilience. So thank you so much for the panelists, for the moderator, for supporting this. Really appreciate your assistance and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.